Hi everyone, welcome to week 6 of Criminal Justice 201. I am Professor Jason Ostro, and this week's lesson is Recruitment and Training. Let's get started. This week we're going to list and describe standards of police selection. We'll review the selection process, and then finally explain the police training process. I know many of you are interested in this subject, so let's begin. Some things to think about as we go through this lesson are: what makes for a good police officer? How can you tell or predict who will be a good police officer? And can anyone be a good police officer with proper training? And I want you to think about those things as we go through the material and as you do your readings and your video assignments for this week, because your discussion board assignment relates to this idea about who can be a good police officer, and is it possible to train anyone? So let's get started. Standards in police selection. First thing you want to think about is height and weight, right? Do those matter? Should they have minimum standards, maximum standards? Does it matter how tall somebody is? Does it matter how short somebody is? How much they weigh? Should there be a minimum amount of weight, 100 pounds, let's say? What about a maximum, 300 pounds? What about vision standards? Is it okay if a police officer has to wear glasses? What about if they're colorblind? Should that preclude them from becoming a police officer? How about hearing tests or any kind of hearing impairment? And then age requirements. What about a minimum age or a maximum age? Well, typically it's 21 and 63, meaning you can be a police officer, can't be a police officer in New York State until you're at least 21. And then typically in New York State, you're required to retire before your 63rd birthday. And so, when you limit like the types of attributes that people can have in order to be police officers, is that a form of discrimination? Age discrimination? Handicap discrimination? Something to think about. Weight discrimination, height discrimination. And then you think about things like education requirements, right? Like, is it okay if police officers only have a high school diploma? What about if they have some college? How about a 4-year degree? Do any of these matter? Well, it's interesting because research indicates that individuals with 4-year degrees typically have better careers than those that have less education. Now, is that something that you should require? What about a prior criminal record? What if they have a felony conviction or domestic violence misdemeanor conviction? Those will preclude people from becoming police officers because in the United States, you can't own a firearm if you have a felony conviction or a domestic violence misdemeanor conviction. How about prior drug use? Marijuana is becoming more and more normalized throughout the United States. Is it okay? Even here in New York State, we have medical marijuana. So if somebody is taking marijuana as for a medical condition, should they still be allowed to be a police officer? What about their employment history? Have they ever been terminated from their job? Have they just up and quit? Did they give valid reasons for leaving one job over the other? These are also some things to think about. The selection process, contrary to what many people believe from the outside, is actually quite rigorous, and it's quite difficult to become a police officer because they go through this lengthy, difficult, and competitive process. And you have to think about this. Police jobs, often it's there's a crisis of hiring, being able to find the appropriate number of people. That's because the requirements are so stringent. So you have to go through a written exam. You have to be able to pass that exam. You have to be able to score high enough on that exam to get called. You have to go through a personal interview. You have to have certain physical fitness requirements that you have to pass. You have to maybe even go through a polygraph exam, a lie detector test, psychological exams, right? Drug testing, medical exams, background investigation. And they're looking through all of these things to determine if you are suitable to become a police officer. And it turns out that many people who think that they're going to become police officers end up not becoming police officers because somewhere along this line, things don't work out for them. Physical fitness, past drug use, employment history, school history, polygraph, any number of things can come up. So during the selection process, police departments typically put you through a pretty rigorous background investigation, which involves an interview as well as a release of information. So you have to give over your HIPAA information, which is your health information, as well as FERPA information, which is your educational information. Those things are protected by law, but you have to sign away your rights in order to allow the police department to look at that stuff. Have you ever been suspended from school? Why were you suspended? Did you go for some type of surgery that you didn't disclose? You have some kind of past psychological history that you didn't want them to know about. When police departments find out about these things, that's like automatic exclusion from consideration because you lied or you tried to cover up. Not so bad. Now, you could always explain, like why you got in trouble in school, but how can you explain why you lied about it? Integrity is incredibly important when it comes to being a police officer, and lying on an application is pretty much grounds for exclusion. Fingerprints, so criminal background, education records, employment history, all this matters. What your neighbors say about you, your past employers say about you, all this figures into your background investigation. Credit history. Do you have a lot of debts, right? Have you ever declared bankruptcy and why? Do you have a lot of credit cards in your name? So, they can look at that. What's your job history? Your driving record? Do you have a lot of summonses? Have you been cited for reckless driving, making a right on red, speeding? Or do you have a lot of parking tickets? Were you in the military? Many people who go into law enforcement have military backgrounds. What were the conditions of your discharge? What about your psychological history? And do you have a history of depression or medication or anything like that? Neighbors, all of this figures into the selection process. And again, this is why many people who think they're going to become police officers end up not becoming successful in the recruitment stage. So when you think about characteristics of good candidates for being police officers, you don't have to be perfect, right? So nobody's perfect. Everybody has some kind of skeleton in their closet, but you have to have some level of honesty and integrity, and you have to be able to demonstrate that. So you think about honesty as telling the absolute truth, and integrity is this idea of actionable honesty. The way in which you act, not just what you say, but the way in which you act. You act out that honesty. Right? You always act appropriately. In policing, they say integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is looking. When you can get away with doing the wrong thing, but you do the right thing anyway because you have integrity, and it's the right thing to do. Certain level of maturity, ability to communicate effectively is really important for police officers. Be able to de-escalate situations, ability to think fast at one's feet. And that's an attribute that not everybody has. Problem solving, emotional intelligence, like this idea of being able to have empathy and understanding other people's points of view, and be able to communicate effectively. Having a certain level of self-control, right? Being able to control oneself and have self-discipline. A certain level of intelligence, of course, is very important as well. And you have to be able to get along with other people because you're going to be dealing with all kinds of people with all different backgrounds, much different than your own. And you have to be able to get along with them, work with them, and help them. And then, of course, somebody who's reliable, right? That shows up to work when they say they're going to, when on time, is a reliable person. So when you think about what some of the factors that might contribute to potential versus absolute disqualification, right? So we have potential means this could disqualify somebody, and absolute means it would disqualify somebody. All right. So potential versus absolute. When we think about potential problems involved in disqualifying you from candidacy for police, think about things like psychological problems. What kind are they? Maybe somebody who has suffered from depression in the past but is, fine, or maybe somebody who's manic depressive. Those are two different types of psychological problems. Are you required to take medication? What about specific types of medications? Even though they're lawful, they can still preclude you from becoming a police officer, like certain types of medications that may make you very, very drowsy, blood thinners, or maybe anti-anxiety medication. You can't really be a cop and be on medication that makes you tired, right? Because you have to be able to act quickly and be alert at all times. What about if you live with somebody who has a criminal record, whether it's your brother, your sister, your mother, your father, or what if it's your spouse? Should that matter? And often when you're a police officer, you can't socialize with anybody who has a criminal record. And what if that person lives in your home? Have you chosen them to live in your home, like your significant other, or is it somebody that you can't help who you were born to, and if one of your parents has a criminal record, it's no fault of your own, right? So do we look at those things differently? Do police departments look at those things differently? What about financial problems? Having a lot of debt, right? Maybe you declared bankruptcy. Those could be red flags for corruption. Poor employment history, right? Somebody who goes from job to job to job, and you go for an interview at the police department. They said, "Why did you leave your last job?" And you say, "Well, I just quit." Well, what is that? How does that sound? Like, don't you have a better explanation? Maybe, you left for other opportunities, or you wasn't a good fit for you, or maybe you started school. So that's something also. Your driving record, that also figures into predicting how your future behavior will be, right? School record, right? Again, remember you have to give that over. What if you were suspended from school, academically disqualified? Those things figure into, your candidacy, potential disqualifications, past drug use, what kind of drugs, how often, how long ago, alcohol use, and of course references. So all of these could be potential disqualifications. Nothing in and of itself, might disqualify you, but maybe a combination of these things, or if you can't give an adequate explanation, then certainly. Absolute disqualifications. Many police departments require that you're a U.S. citizen. So if you're not, then you just don't qualify. In New York State, like the NYPD requires that you have a valid New York State driver's license, which seems to make sense, right? So many people who grow up in urban areas don't drive until they have to, and that could be a barrier for you being able to get a driver's license. Felony conviction, automatic, right? Because you can't own a firearm. Misdemeanor domestic violence conviction, same thing, can't own a firearm. So that's a disqualification. Conviction, remember, not arrest, but conviction. Suicide attempts, that's a big problem. Mental health in policing is a major, major problem. And if you have a history of mental health problems and a suicide attempt, that would definitely disqualify you. I mean, you might say, well, how would they find out? Because you have to give your medical records over to the police department. And, you were hospitalized for a suicide attempt, it's going to be reasonable, very reasonable to say this person's not qualified to give a firearm to and trust life or death. Current drug use, sure, absolutely, right? Whether you agree with legalization or um, the de-enforcement of certain types of drug offenses is irrelevant. Police officers are required to adhere to the Constitution and applicable law. Where the law says that certain drugs are illegal, and if you choose to use them, then you're breaking the law, and you cannot be a cop. It's really that simple, right? Uh, dishonesty, and that's a big problem. That's what will turn a potential disqualification into a absolute disqualification. You got fired from your job and you lied about it on your application, and the police department finds out about it. And they find out about it because they go to your past employers, they look at your W-2s, you have to give over your social security records so they know who you worked for when you worked. And, you got fired because you got involved in some kind of misconduct and you didn't tell them. Okay, so now you have to explain why you lied and you got fired instead of why you just got fired. And the dishonesty part of that is what really makes you untrustworthy and calls into question your integrity, and that makes you disqualified. Now, everybody has skeletons in the closet. Well, you could say, I was young, I made a mistake, if that in fact is true, and I was terminated from my job, and I learned from it and moved on, and it never happened again. Okay, it happened 10 years ago when I was 17, 18. That makes sense. But what doesn't make sense is the fact that you're dishonest. So dishonesty on application, no good. And specific types of disabilities will disqualify you too, right? Hearing, color blindness, physical abnormalities, diseases, things of that nature. So those can disqualify you. Those will disqualify you as well. So once you make it through this process, which is actually quite vigorous, you have to go through the recruit training process, and this typically begins at the police academy, and this could be a commuter or residential academy. Commuter means you go there every day. Residential means you live there during the week. You have a mandated minimum number of hours for training in New York State. That's mandated by New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services. Police departments could always give you more, but they can never give you less. And academic training involves typically law, police science, behavioral sciences, social sciences, that sort of thing. And specialized training related to dealing with people in mental health crisis, communication, things of that nature. Then you also do this physical training and tactics. There's a video this week on the New York State Trooper Training Academy, which is a residential academy, which is part of your assignment for the week to review that. So just make sure you do so. Recruit training also involves a whole bunch of other types of specialized training, including this academic training, EVOC, which is the Emergency Vehicle Operators course, where you learn how to drive like a cop, right, so to speak. They call this other type of training called FATS training, Firearms and Tactics Simulator, where they give you all these types of scenarios on a screen, and you have to react to those scenarios, and depending on how you react to them, you may be required to use deadly physical force with a firearm. Now it's an inert firearm, meaning it doesn't actually shoot bullets, but it's hooked up to the computer system. Fitness, tactics training, crisis intervention training now is very, very popular, which involves, responding to individuals and mental health crisis, very important. On the job training also is after you graduate the academy, you may go through training at various intervals throughout your career. Once you graduate the academy, typically police departments will assign you to some sort of field training officer or field training unit first few months, maybe even a year. And that's sort of like you're under close supervision of a senior officer or a supervisor. And, typically this will go on throughout your probationary period. And of course, like I mentioned before, in-service training is like throughout a police officer's career, which is, really important. Okay, so I went through all that material. You have a couple of things to do this week in terms of your assignments, right? First is there's a reading on there. It's called the Model Police Officer Recruitment and Training, and that'll give you a really good sense of what training is like, or some of the nuts and bolts of training in terms of police training. So take a look at that. Then also, I'd like you to review the New York State Police training video. It's about 2.5 minutes long, 3 minutes long, but it's actually really quite good, and it gives you a good sense of what police training is really like. And then I want you to read this article about Christian Torres, who was the ideal police candidate, or so it seemed. And then he ended up, well, you'll find out what happens then. Okay, and then you also have a discussion board assignment, and you have a PDF document that is embedded in this week's discussion board assignment for you to review. And I want you to put all this together and answer that the best you can. Again, it's due before Thursday, and the follow-up is due, responses due before Sunday. I wish you all the very best of luck this week, and if you have any questions, of course, please feel free to reach out, and I'll see you online.